Hey guys, tonight we drift into the world of sleepy myths and even sleepier melodies. Picture yourself on the edge of an ancient riverbank, where the breeze carries the lazy scent of moss and warm reeds. You can almost hear the distant twang of a lyre, soft, unsure, and meandering like a dream you half remember from last week. In this story, you're not some hero on a world-saving quest, or even a concerned citizen trying to stop a goat-headed god from marrying your neighbor's cousin. No, you're Orpheus, the guy with the musical touch who once charmed stones, trees, and the actual underworld. But tonight, you're tired. Not just of tragedy or fate or poetry that rhymes with Eurydice, but of humans altogether. And so, you found yourself wandering through the soft underbrush of a river trail, trying to find an audience that won't interrupt, cry, or ask for autographs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy stream reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You meander along the river like a breeze with knees. You don't even carry your lyre anymore, you just hum, letting the tune hang in the evening air like forgotten laundry. The sun is doing that half-hearted gold shimmer across the water, and you pause to watch it, because that's the kind of thing you do now. The world may have once called you a genius, a prophet of sound, the voice that made Hades himself go okay, fine, but now your only goal is to outsing a frog, because frogs, as it turns out, are very committed performers. You hum a few notes, delicate ones, a little mournful, a little shy, and the frogs just stare, croaking in chaotic baritone. One even belches with what you can only interpret as smugness. So of course, you try again. You shift the melody, flatten the note, echo it off a rock. Still no applause. Just frogs. Watching. Judging. This is how low it's gotten. It wasn't always this quiet. Back in your prime, people crowded temples to hear you play. They said your music could stop storms, tame lions, make angry grandmothers forgive each other over ancient olive stew. But humans, well, they come with complications. Questions, screaming children, debt, and honestly, after losing Eurydice a second time, yes, we'll get there, it all felt hollow. So you left, not in a dramatic, toga-fluttering exit, but more of a quiet, emotionally exhausted sidestep out of civilization. You found rivers, trees, moth clouds, places where your chords could hang in the air without being graded, dissected, or tweeted about. Historians still argue whether you were depressed, enlightened, or just suffering from an aggressively introverted phase. Here's one fact though. The rivers of Thessaly, where you've taken up your quiet residence, were once known for their gentle musicality. Ancient writers, most of whom had suspiciously poetic names, claimed that the way water rolled over stones, there could inspire verses. It's not entirely wrong. You do feel something shift in your chest every time the river gurgles in a particularly sleepy pattern. It's like a lullaby written by geography, and so you try to match it. Your hums become longer, breathier, more attuned to water than wind. You use your mouth like a cave. You use your throat like a riverbed. It's not about performance anymore. It's about finding a frequency that belongs, And that's when it happens. A fish jumps. It's not dramatic. It doesn't spin 3 times or wink. It just arcs out of the water right as you strike a shimmering note midway between a flat and existential disappointment. And for some reason, that moment lives in your chest like a tiny flame dot. So the next day, you sit by the same spot. You hum again. Another fish jumps. Coincidence, maybe, but your heart skips like a badly tuned harp. You repeat the pattern. Higher note, no splash. Lower note, another splash. Is it possible? Could the fish be listening? You test this idea, day after day, night after night. You bring your lyre again, reluctantly, the way someone brings an old pair of sandals out of retirement. You pluck softly. The strings echo over the water. Nothing. Then, a ripple, a bubble, a dart of silver. It's not applause, but it's something. You begin to believe you're onto something groundbreaking. Or possibly sleep-deprived, because here's a quirky tidbit. Ancient Greeks had water spirits called naiads, and some believed that fish were their messengers. If anyone would bother composing a tune for aquatic messengers of semi-divine nymphs, it'd be you. You start tuning your lyre differently. Less for performance halls, more for watery acoustics. Strings dampened with river reeds, frames smoothed with driftwood. You sit cross-legged in muddy banks, drawing spirals in the dirt while listening for tiny tail splashes. Your melodies become slow, gliding, nearly liquid themselves. Fish don't clap, but they move. You notice how some gather when you hit certain keys, others scatter. One fish, you name her Melisma, seems to respond best to minor thirds. You've officially stopped caring what people think. And here's the secret: they never tell you about the myths. The boring parts are where the magic hides, not the dramatic underworld showdowns or godly negotiations. It's in the slow, damp hours where a man and a trout sort of, maybe, almost understand each other. You start waking up earlier now, not because you're brimming with purpose or ambition or some dramatic, divine calling, but because the river sounds nicest right before dawn. The frogs are quieter, the birds are still debating whether to get out of bed, and the fish are, strangely, at their most musical, or at least, you think they are. It's hard to be sure, considering they're fish, but you swear you can hear their little flutters and flicks syncing up with your notes like a shy percussion section. Still, part of you knows this shift didn't happen in a vacuum. Once upon a myth, you had a reason. A flame-haired, soft-stepped reason named Eurydice. She loved your music not because of the fame, but because you once composed an entire ballad based on the way she sneezed when the sun hit her nose just right. You'd trade every lyre string in Athens just to hear that laugh again, the one that snorted halfway through and made the gods question their aesthetic standards. But she's gone now, twice gone, which is a very specific kind of grief. The first time, she was bitten by a snake. The second time, she slipped away when you turned your head your head too soon. You broke the one rule Hades gave you, don't look back. Which, to be fair, is an extremely difficult instruction when your possibly resurrected wife is walking behind you in total silence. Since then, music's been your way of apologizing to her, to yourself, to gravity. You tried to write a song that would reverse time, rewind the journey, rerun the myth with a better ending. You performed it in every temple, grove, and bathhouse that would have you. And then one day, you just stopped, because none of it brought her back, so you traded city marble for riverbank mud, traded applause for the whisper of dragonflies bouncing off your forehead. You stopped composing for people. You started composing instead instead of talking, instead of grieving, instead of yelling at the stars. But even in your quiet exile, the gods are nosy. You hear their whispers sometimes. Not real words, just weird breezes that carry your name, or random goats that seem far too interested in your scales. One time, a squirrel dropped an olive pit on your shoulder, precisely on the beat. Coincidence? Maybe, probably. But you've seen stranger. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you to hum. 2 Greek musicians often tuned their instruments using the Pythagorean system, based on the mathematical ratios of string lengths. You tried that once, for 5 minutes, before realizing that fish don't care about math, they care about vibes. So you threw the ratios into the river and tuned your lyre to the feel of dew and disappointment. Lately, you've begun crafting whole underwater-themed sonatas. There's the Glub Waltz, inspired by a carp that once yawned mid-verse, and Bubble Fugue in C, which is basically just you strumming while blowing into a clay pot submerged halfway into the riverbank. Admittedly, not your most glamorous era, but here's the twist. You're happier now, not in the grinning, teeth sparkle kind of way, in a softer, quieter way. Like a loaf of bread, cooling on a windowsill that knows it's never going to be eaten in, is kind of okay with that. Every note you play for the fish is a note Eurydice never heard, and somehow that makes it feel sacred, untouchable. Yours, you've even built yourself. A little stool really, just a pile of stones you think look supportive and you perch there. Each morning like a mythological gargoyle with excellent posture. You hum scales, slow and sleepy. Fish surface. Some dart off. Some seem to linger. One turtle, slow as sorrow, bobs his head in something that suspiciously resembles rhythm. You name him Allegro, as a joke. And speaking of jokes, remember when you used to perform at Mount Parnassus? You wore fancy robes, lined with embroidered fig leaves, and you had actual groupies who braided olive branches into your hair. Now, you're wearing a tunic so damp it might as well be considered aquatic fashion, and your biggest fan is a crab who keeps trying to steal your toe ring. Historians still argue whether you truly gave up on humanity or just needed a really, really long break. Some think you were inventing a new form of music therapy. Others claim you were slowly turning into a river deity out of spite. One fragment of ancient papyrus even suggests you were trying to translate fish language into harmony, which true means you were either a genius or profoundly dehydrated. Either way, the shift is real. You notice that you're smiling more, even if it's mostly at weird algae formations that look like celebrity profiles. You start documenting which notes make frogs croak more aggressively G-sharp, for some reason, and which attract dragonflies. You begin to feel not like a castaway from myth, but like part of the landscape itself, a strange, soft melody woven into the branches and ripples. You hum while the sun rises. You hum while the turtles nap. You hum not for applause, or love, or validation. You hum because sound is movement, and movement is living, and living is somehow still happening. And one morning, as you strum a particularly wistful tune that makes even the gnats hover in thoughtful silence, you realize something unusual. You're being watched, not by mortals. Not by fish, by reeds tall, clustered, with tips that sway to your rhythm. You squint, you strum again, they twitch in time. You change the tempo, so do they. You pause, they pause. It's ridiculous, but also oddly encouraging. Nature seems to be answering. You're not sure if the reeds are really listening, but you like the idea too much to argue with it. So you give them a private concert, low and slow and full of sliding notes. You even bow afterward, which earns you a small gust of wind in the shape of polite applause. You chuckle alone, content, and maybe a little bit mad, but honestly, in this quiet little riverside life, where your lyre smells faintly of moss and your heart no longer echoes like an empty temple, madness feels a lot like peace at this point. You're starting to consider whether insects count as critics. Because lately, they've been unusually opinionated. Cicadas scream over your softer arpeggios. Beetles march in time with your faster rhythms. And the reeds, yes, those suspiciously coordinated reeds have now been joined by dragonflies who hover like orchestral conductors with glittery wings and no sense of timing. You take it in stride. After all, when your primary audience has gills or wings, expectations are lower. No one's tweeting their outrage if you miss a note. No patrons threatening to withhold figs unless you nail the crescendo. Out here, art lives and dies in the moment, then floats gently downstream like a leaf that forgot to be important. But it does start to bother you. Just a little, that the frogs still won't harmonize. You've written 3 separate lullabies. Specifically for them each, one progressively sleepier, wetter, and more frog-adjacent hand. Still nothing. They blink, they croak. They resume staring as if auditioning to become decorative pond ornaments. You try to take it as a compliment, so instead you turn your musical attention to the bugs, specifically cicadas. Loud, relentless, wildly off. Cicadas, at first, they drive you up the proverbial olive tree. But one morning, mid-melody, you notice something strange. Your D major chord silences them. Not just lowers their volume, stops them. It's as if you hit a musical mute button hidden in the bushes. You strum again, D major, silence, then slowly, cautiously, a single cicada chirps back. It's off-key, it's shrill, but it's a response. And suddenly, you're in a duet with a bug. Naturally, you get competitive. You spend the next week creating elaborate calandresponse sequences, testing how many cicadas you can get to follow your leads. You start naming them Shrillium, Buzz, Lightyear, and your personal favorite, Treble. The reeds become your unofficial stage backdrop, swaying helpfully during solos. You even repurpose a hollow gourd as percussion, mostly because it makes a bunk sound that's hilariously satisfying. You also try experimenting with your environment. One day you prop your lyre against a rock while you hum into a patch of tall grass. The resonance changes, softer, more hushed. The grass seems to drink the notes instead of reflecting them. You wonder if plants, too, respond to music. Not scientifically, you're not that kind of bard, but in a maybe trees like lo-fi kind of way. And that's when the reeds retaliate. Not in any overt, aggressive fashion. But you begin to notice that whenever you switch key to something, dissonance, a messy F diminished, they shudder. Like they're cringing, the dragonflies scatter. Even the beetles lose rhythm. You repeat the note, shudder. Repeat again, shudder. Congratulations, you've offended grass. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. In some ancient Greek poetry, reeds were said to have whispering spirits, the kind that eavesdrop on gossip and repeat it during windstorms. If that's true, you've probably just become the subject of a very judgmental breeze. But you press on, because next up in your grand aquatic musical conquest, reeds themselves. You try cutting one, carefully, respectfully. You fashion it into a crude flute, more like a pipe. Really, and begin experimenting. The sound is breathy, haunting, like a ghost whistling through a straw. Not exactly concert hall quality, but intriguing. You start combining it with your lyre, layering the reed flute's airy tone over your humming. The cicadas don't love it. The frogs remain unmoved, but the fish seem to notice. They start appearing earlier, gathering in tighter clusters. You even spot one carp attempting something that looks suspiciously like synchronized tail wiggling. You're developing a theory, one you never expected to hold, that music specifically is crossing boundaries, not just social or cultural, but elemental. You're reaching earth through reeds, air through insects, and now, water through fish. Historians still argue whether this theory had any basis in reality, or if you were simply so sleep-deprived from all the river fog and dragonfly serenades that you hallucinated half your musical career. But to you it's real. You write a new piece ode to amphibious indifference, and perform it exclusively for frogs, just to be petty. It features several passive-aggressive pauses, and one climactic silence, so long it becomes its own note. They don't react. One scratches itself with a lazy foot. Fine. You turn your attention to the reeds again. This time, instead of playing for them, you play with them. You stick the base of your lyre into a cluster of damp stalks and let the vibrations carry through. The notes sound thinner, but somehow more alive. Like the reeds are singing back, amplifying you in a way you never asked for but deeply appreciate. And then, because you're a bard and you live for overkill, you decide to start recording your findings, not in parchment, not in clay, in songs. Every fish twitch, every dragonfly hover, every judgmental reed shiver becomes a motif, a theme, a piece of a greater, possibly ridiculous, possibly divine symphony. You call it the aquatic cycle. Volume 1, Symphony for Swamp Things. Volume 2, The Grass Also Sings. Volume 3, still untitled, but heavily features accidental toad cameos. At this point, you've abandoned the idea of ever returning to human society. You're far too invested in your new ecosystem-based musical career. You even consider applying for divine status as the patron of overly specific natural melodies. You imagine your temple a modest mud hut surrounded by reeds, fish statues, and a frog who's slightly too close to the altar. It's the quietest, strangest kind of fame. No coins, no laurel crowns. Just the knowledge that somewhere in the damp green blur of riverbanks, your music exists in ripples and rustles. That's enough. And if someone, someday, finds your abandoned lyre propped against a stone, still strung with reeds and half-tuned to a cicada's dying note, maybe they'll play it. Maybe a fish will twitch. Maybe the frogs will still ignore it. But maybe, just maybe, they'll feel a tug in their chest. A warmth, a memory, a whisper that something once sang here, quietly, and without expectation. After spending so many days testing melodies on frogs, cicadas, reeds, and the occasional uncooperative turtle, you come to an unexpected conclusion. Fish don't get distracted. No chit-chatting, no side-eye, no tapping feet, they simply listen. Or at least, they don't interrupt. You start thinking maybe fish make the best audience. You begin to notice patterns in their movements. Certain notes make them dart quickly to the surface, like they're trying to catch invisible treats. Other notes lull them into slow, lazy circles beneath lily pads. One afternoon, while playing a gentle sequence, a school of tiny fish clusters in a perfect semicircle, almost as if they're waiting for an encore. You're enchanted. It's a far cry from the crowded, noisy amphitheaters of your past, where humans shouted for encores and sometimes threw olives. Now, your audience is patient, uncritical, and completely waterproof. They don't demand favors or question your costume choices. No one complains about your pitch or your tendency to mumble lyrics. The fish, by contrast, seem entirely absorbed. They shimmer in the late afternoon sun, gliding effortlessly through shafts of light that make their scales glitter like scattered coins. You even catch a glimpse of a larger fish, maybe a bass or a carpoo, seems to watch you with a steady, almost regal gaze. As if you were some kind of aquatic bard, you start imagining what it would be like if you could compose specifically for these creatures. You try adjusting your lyre's tuning to lower pitches, deeper vibrations that might travel underwater better. You pluck the strings more slowly, letting each note linger like a droplet spreading through the river. This is no small feat. Sound travels differently through water, and your lyre, designed for dry air and human ears, often sounds muffled or tinny. When you try to adapt it, you fiddle with techniques, sometimes playing just above the water's surface, sometimes dipping the strings in briefly to see what resonance you get one day. Out of curiosity, you try humming underwater. Not full-throated, but a gentle murmur, letting your breath ripple through the current. To your surprise, a few fish pause their movements, as if surprised by the new kind of sound. A tiny school follows you upstream for a moment, weaving alongside your fingers. This discovery thrills you. You're breaking boundaries, venturing into realms where music and nature blur. You realize you're not just playing notes anymore, you're communicating. Maybe not words, but feelings. Vibrations of calm, sadness, hope, or just plain curiosity. And yet, not everyone is thrilled about this new aquatic serenade. Poseidon, god of the sea, occasionally grumbles from the depths. Not loud enough to stop you, but enough to make you wonder if you're treading on sacred fin territory. Legend says he dislikes musicians near his watery domain unless they pay proper respects, something you might have neglected in your riverbank retreat. One evening, as twilight filters through the reeds, you're startled by a sudden splash. An octopus, curious and perhaps a bit mischievous, emerges from a nearby rock crevice. It waves a tentacle as if demanding a solo. You oblige, improvising a slow, winding melody that seems to hypnotize the creature. The octopus dances, or at least it flails tentacles rhythmically. You laugh quietly, the first genuine smile in weeks, and realize this watery world is full of surprises. You begin to think this might be the truest audience you've ever had, silent, mysterious, and endlessly patient. Historians still argue, Whether your obsession with fish music was a genuine artistic breakthrough or a quirky form of escapism. Some say you were pioneering early aquatic sound therapy. Others insist you simply preferred finned friends over fickle humans. Regardless, this period of your life remains one of the most enigmatic and least documented, but you, Orpheus, continue to composely winding melodies that ripple through water and time. You write for fish, for reeds, for the very essence of nature's quiet heartbeat. And somewhere deep in that serene aquatic concert, you find a fragment of peace. Your fishy audience quickly earns a special place in your heart. Among all the gliding scales and darting fins, the turtles become your unexpected muses, slow-moving, deliberate, almost regal in their underwater ponderings. These creatures seem to absorb your melodies differently than the frenetic minnows or twitchy perch. You notice that when you play slower, deeper tones, turtles respond by poking their heads above water and settling on the riverbank like ancient, wise sentinels. Their shell patterns glisten in the late sun, etched with the stories of ages past, unbothered by the chaos of the outside world. They aren't fans of fast music, no surprise there, but they appear enchanted by the gentle lulls, the hums that mirror the quiet heartbeat of the earth. You start referring to them as your rhythm section, a joke you share aloud with a passing heron who, unsurprisingly, pays no attention. The turtle's slow nodding motions seem to provide an oddly steady tempo to your otherwise wandering melodies. Sometimes, you imagine they're conducting the river's pulse itself. This new companionship emboldens your musical experiments. You craft pieces designed specifically for their pace, with drawn-out notes that echo the steady plod of their limbs. You hum a slow dirge that flows like a winding river, rising and falling with the turtle's movements. The harmony feels ancient, like the shells themselves. One curious moment stands out. While playing by a quiet cove, a young turtle suddenly approaches your toes, nibbles lightly, and then retreats with a splash. You interpret this as applause or, at least, a polite critique. Encouraged, you compose a short melody, inspired by their slow grace. You dub it the turtle's lullaby, a piece so slow it threatens to lull even the most restless souls into peaceful surrender. This affinity isn't lost on the wildlife scholars who watch from afar. A fringe theory even suggests that your fascination with turtles inspired an ancient belief that these creatures carried the weight of the world on their backs, balancing chaos and calm. Maybe, you muse, it's your music that inspired such tales, slow melodies echoing the steadfast strength of these gentle reptiles. But it's not all tranquil. The turtle's calm demeanor sometimes clashes with your restless creativity. When you try to speed up your rhythms or introduce sudden shifts, they withdraw, retreating into the water like shy listeners fearing dissonance. It's a delicate dance, this balance between impulse and patience. And while turtles offer a reliable tempo, their slow pace challenges your desire to innovate. You wrestle with this, wanting to push your music forward while honoring the serene cadence they embody. You start wondering whether music should always move faster, or sometimes simply be existing in slow, thoughtful moments. Historians still argue whether this turtle-inspired period marked a turning point in your musical evolution, or was merely a brief pause before your next aquatic adventure. Some claim it symbolized your acceptance of time's inevitable flow. Others suggest it was your way of coping with loss by embracing the slow, steady rhythms of nature. Whatever the truth, the turtles remain your loyal, if slow-moving rhythm section. You play on, weaving your melodies through water and time, discovering new harmonies in the silence between ripples. Your growing aquatic orchestra faces an unexpected challenge: underwater acoustics. Sound behaves very differently when it travels through water, and you quickly discover that your lyre's crisp plucks and bright notes become muffled and dull beneath the surface. You try dipping the strings in the river, hoping the water will carry the melodies further, but instead, it just warps the tone, making your beautiful chords sound like a cat in distress, determined not to let this acoustic quirk spoil your underwater serenades. You start experimenting. You test echo caves along the riverbank, shouting notes and listening to the watery rebounds. You try singing into hollow reeds, hoping their natural resonance will amplify your voice like a primitive microphone. Sometimes, you even fill empty clay jars with water, tapping rhythms on their surfaces to see how the sound ripples its tedious work. Days spent in damp caves, your fingers stiff and your voice hoarse, but slowly, you learn which spots carry your notes best, where the echoes shimmer, and where the silence swallows your tunes whole. You find that narrow underwater tunnels act like natural amplifiers, making even the faintest hum sound grand. One day, while testing your ideas in a flooded cave, you hear something unexpected. A chorus of fish, bubbling and clicking, almost like they're joining your music. You hesitate, are they truly responding, or is your tired mind creating company? It doesn't matter. You feel the thrill of a duet, no matter how strange it might be. But there's a catch. Your experiments occasionally ruffle fins. Poseidon's realm isn't yours to invade lightly. You learn the hard way when a wave crashes near you during a particularly loud practice session. A booming voice, or perhaps just a very grumpy tide, seems to warn you away from sacred salt water. In some versions of the tale, it's said Poseidon himself grew annoyed with your persistent singing near his waters, sending storms to silence your lyre. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's just the river's way of reminding you that boundaries exist, even for a musician. Still, you persist. You try subtle adjustments, singing softer, moving to brackish zones where river meets sea, playing tunes that honor the god of the ocean. You craft melodies that mimic the rolling of waves, hoping to soothe divine tempers. Occasionally, the water responds with gentle ripples, a sign you might be forgiven among your new aquatic audience. Creatures emerge to add unexpected flourishes. An octopus, curious and clever, begins showing up during your sessions. This cephalopod isn't content to simply watch. It flails tentacles in what you interpret as interpretive dance. Its movements are erratic but strangely rhythmic. Adding an organic percussion to your melodies, you find yourself laughing something rare these days as you try to synchronize your tunes with its limbs. The octopus becomes your unlikely stage partner, disrupting the quiet with chaotic yet charming performances. Sometimes it grabs your lyre, plucking strings with tentacles, producing bizarre but fascinating sounds. Other sea creatures join the scene. Crabs tap claws on rocks, creating sharp claps. Eels slither through reeds, emitting electric pulses that almost seem musical. Your riverside concerts evolve into a symphony of aquatic lift, a blend of your human artistry and nature's spontaneous rhythms. Historians still debate whether these collaborations were actual events or symbolic storytelling, perhaps metaphors for your internal struggle between grief and creation. Whatever the truth, your underwater performances become legendary in whispers. A secret concert held for fish, mollusks, and gods alike. Through it all, your music adapts and grows, shaped by the environment, the creatures, and even the gods. Moods. You are no longer just Orpheus, the human musician. You are Orpheus, the aquatic bard, weaving melodies beneath the surface where few dare to listen. Your fame, strange and watery though it may be, begins to spread in subtle ripples rather than roaring waves. Fishermen swear that the river hums before dawn, carrying soft, mournful music beneath its mist. Children claim to hear lullabies from reeds when the wind dies. And some, the oldest and least inclined to mock what they do not understand, leave offerings by the riverbank, not to Poseidon, not to any known deity, but to you. You do not see yourself as divine. You do not crave shrines or sacrifice, but the notion that others feel comforted by your presence, that your music, forged from grief and shaped by strange partnerships, soothes more than just your own weary soul, that idea becomes quietly precious to you. You spend hours each day perfecting your craft, not out of vanity, but because the act itself is meditative. You find melodies in the gurgle of streams, rhythms in the slap of fishtails, even harmonies in the croaks of fat frogs resting on lily pads. No sound is wasted. Every splash and rustle might be a note waiting to be caught, and your companions are constant now. The octopus returns again and again, each time more theatrical. It begins to bring you things: shiny shells, bits of glass worn smooth by the tide, even a silver ring once worn by someone who likely met an untimely end at sea. It seems to understand gifting, or perhaps it mimics your rituals. You tie some of these offerings into your hair. Others, you string into necklaces. They clink as you move, giving your every gesture a soft musical accent. You become something of a river spirit yourself, part man, part myth, trailing tokens from the deep and melodies from nowhere. Occasionally, travelers come close, drawn by rumor. Most never find you. They hear you, perhaps, or glimpse the octopus, waving madly from a tide pool like a deranged oracle. But you are elusive, more memory than man to them, and that suits you fine. Too many eyes might dilute what you've built, but not all attention is benign. One day, while composing a lullaby for a sleeping heron, you hear a noise less natural than the usual sounds of the river. It is the crunch of boots on gravel, a rustle of armor. Men, not beasts. Hunters, perhaps. Or soldiers. You pause mid-note, fingers frozen on the lyre. They appear 3 figures, cloaked but unmistakably human. They don't speak at first. They just watch. One steps forward, lifts his hood, and you see the kind of face that has never suffered poetry, flat-eyed, hungry, but not for beauty. He speaks your name, and it cuts through you like a broken string. Orpheus. You do not answer, not aloud. You strum a low, wary chord, letting the water carry the sound. He continues, saying things about reputation, about songs that can sway men's hearts and lull enemies to sleep. He talks about kings and wars and the usefulness of music as a weapon. You realize he's not come for your songs. He's come to cage them, to turn them into tools. You try to leave quietly, but the second figure raises a neta fisherman's snare, large enough for you and your lyre. You understand, then, the danger of being known, even in whispers. You do what you must. You sing. Not a song of sorrow, but one of illusion. You summon images of crashing waves and rising tides, of sea serpents coiling just beyond vision, of drowning salt and blinding mist. The river responds, its surface boiling with sudden life. Mist curls, dense and fast. The octopus joins in, flinging silt and water as if painting chaos. The men stumble, shout, and retreat, whether from fear or disorientation, you do not know. But when the fog lifts, they are gone. You are alone again. Your song worked. For now you do not sleep that night. You sit with your back to a rock, the lyre across your lap like a shield. The river moves beside you, quietly protective. The octopus clings to your ankle, pulsing gently. You realize that the peace you've built is more fragile than you believed. The next day, you travel up river. You abandon your familiar haunts. You say goodbye to the heron, to the lily pads, to the reeds that once sang in chorus. You move toward places even your songs have not touched, dark coves, brackish lagoons, long-forgotten tributaries where light hesitates and moss reigns. There, among tangled roots and sleeping insects, you start again. You build new instruments. From driftwood and gut, you invent chords that no one has ever played. You let your melodies slip into silence sometimes, allowing the space between notes to speak. And you keep your music to yourself for now, for safety, for growth. Still, you hum sometimes. Softly, the octopus listens. The frogs resume their croaking accompaniment. Even here, even now, your audience finds you, and you continue. The swampy inland where you now dwell has no name, at least not one spoken in common tongues. It's a maze of knotted trees and fog-heavy mornings, where the sun filters through damp branches like spilled honey. Time behaves oddly here. Days melt into one another, and the river speaks in a dialect of gurgles and sighs known only to the mosses and egrets. But you find the slowness comforting. You build yourself a shelter not of walls and roofs, but of careful routines. Each morning begins with the same ritual. You dip your hands into the cold stream, feeling the flow thread through your fingers. Then you tune your lyre, which now has fishbone frets and string loops soaked in salt to make their tone sharper. Finally, you hum not a full song, but a note to greet the day. Like knocking on the door of a home that belongs to the fog, you grow quiet in this new life. The showmanship you once knew, the swelling of chords for amphitheaters, the crowd-pleasing crescendos is gone. Your music now is as subtle as the ripples in a frog pond. It does not ask for applause. It asks only to exist. Still, the river is never fully silent. One evening, as you finish a song meant only for the breeze, you hear a cough. A human cough, unmistakably so. You freeze. Your fingers still on the strings. The voice that follows is hesitant, not cruel. You're him, aren't you? It says, the river singer. You look up and see a child no older than 10, standing barefoot in the shallows. Their hair is tangled with burrs, their tunic patched and wet from travel. They hold no weapons, no torch, just a reed flute tucked beneath one arm and a face to open to lie. You nod once. No need to deny what can't be hidden. The child steps closer. I heard you, they say. 3 days ago I followed the music. They don't ask permission. They sit cross-legged at the water's edge and begin to play. It is not good, the notes are clumsy, the rhythm erratic. But there's something honest in Itra and trembling like the call of a lost bird. You do not smile, but you listen. When they finish, they look at you not with pride, but hope. Will you teach me? You should say no. This life you've carved is too delicate. One voice has already drawn danger. 2 might sing your undoing, but the child waits. And you remember what it was like to yearn for guidance, to scream into the void for a master who would show you where to place your fingers, how to breathe between notes so you nod again. Lessons. Begin the next morning. You say little. You show them how to find hollow reeds, how to dry them by firelight without cracking them, how to listen before playing, how to breathe not from the throat but the belly. The child listens more than they speak. Their hands are quick, their mind quicker. You do not ask their name. You lie back again, letting the croaks, plucks, and plinks fold over you. It's not just boring, it's beautifully boring, soothing in its predictability, repetitive in a way that seems to smooth out the crinkles in your thoughts. You think about how ancient rituals may have used this same sensation-rhythmic comfort to lull minds into dream states. Orpheus wouldn't call it hypnosis. He'd say it's resonance. Getting your heartbeat to sync with the earth's drum. You hear him softly mutter a new phrase, call and repose. It's a concept he's been working on. The idea that music isn't just a sequence of sounds, but a breathing system. Inhale call, exhale rest. He believes that even the most chaotic symphony must obey this law. Even frogs, it turns out, breathe to a beat. Later, as stars slip gently into the water's reflection, Orpheus finally lowers his lyre. His fingers are stained with pollen and mud. His sandals are damp, but his eyes gleam with the calm of someone who's heard frogs sing in harmony and lived to tell about it. You ask him if it's done. He shrugs. It's always done, he says, and never done. That's music. You consider this? Then yawn deeply. You don't even remember closing your eyes. Only that when you wake again just for a moment it's to the soft plink-plink of water dripping into a bowl. And somewhere, in the distance, Gregory the Frog is still holding down the beat. By morning, Orpheus is nowhere to be seen, but his footprints lead westward, smudged slightly by dew. You stretch, slowly, deliberately, as if each limb were being reassembled after a particularly restful hibernation. The fig tree has dropped 3 soft fruits by your side, and one of them has been half-eaten by an industrious beetle, who now rests nearby, full and drowsy. You decide to leave him be. He earned that breakfast. The marsh hums differently now. The frogs have gone quiet, their shift completed. And now the insects resume their delicate buzzings, more static than music, but not without rhythm. You wander to the edge of the reeds, still unsure whether you dreamt the entire frog symphony. But then, just beyond the cattails, you see it. A row of carefully balanced lily pads, arranged in spirals. It's unmistakable. Orpheus left a notation behind, not in ink, but in geometry. You chuckle quietly to yourself. No one would believe this back in Athens or anywhere really. A marsh arrangement written in frog intervals and pad spacing. But then again, Orpheus never composed for humans alone. He wrote for everything that moved and murmured and exhaled under the sky. You follow the footprints out of the marsh, your sandals squelching gently until they lead you back to a dry trail, lined with olive trees. There, seated on a smooth boulder and staring contemplatively at a distant hill, is Orpheus tuning his lyre against the whistle of the morning breeze. His expression is unreadable, somewhere between sleepy satisfaction and mathematical meditation. You think the frogs will remember the chorus? You ask, sitting beside him. He smiles, but doesn't look at you. They don't need to. They are the chorus. You accept this, because somehow, in Orpheus's world, that makes perfect sense. The rest of the morning drifts by in a kind of meditative silence. Orpheus is preparing something new, you can tell. He strums in intervals too spacious to be idle. Notes are placed carefully, like stones across a stream. You watch birds in the distance flutter across a grain field, landing then lifting in a pattern that resembles yet see exactly the phrasing of the chords Orpheus is playing. He catches your gaze and raises an eyebrow. You see it now. You nod. Choreography of birds. Or rhythm of harvest, he says. Depending on where you start counting. He plucks 3 high notes, spaced like droplets from a leaky roof. You've noticed his music doesn't always progress, sometimes it settles. Like moss on stone. No climax, no explosion, just presence. That's when he starts talking about millstones. Apparently, he once followed an old farmer for weeks, yes, weeks just to record the rhythmic pulse of a rotating stone wheel grinding wheat into flour. He said it had the most consistent tempo he'd ever heard. But the wheel squeaked, you point out. He smiles again. Exactly. That squeak made the whole thing swing. One small drag in the loop, just enough to keep it human. You realize he's describing not just rhythm, but imperfection as rhythm. The heartbeat isn't a metronome, after all. It's a story, steady but never mechanical. And Orpheus, he's always hunting for those nearly invisible drags and hiccups in the world's soundscape. That's where his songs live. You drift again, this time sitting upright. Thoughts become woolly. The sun rises behind your eyelids, warmth seeping in from behind them. Orpheus plucks a chord so soft you feel it more than hear it. Your breathing slows, sinking to the breeze. You don't realize until much later that he's guiding you to sleep with 4 descending notes, repeated like a mantra. Each time they come around, your mind releases one more thought, one more tight knot of alertness. Plink dot 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 plink dot dot plunk dot dot pause dot plink dot dot plink dot dot plunk dot dot pause. It's a lullaby for minds too busy to rest on their own. And as you lean back against the sun-warmed rock, your last coherent thought is this: he's not just playing music, he's sculpting silence around it. And in that silence, you fall again. Not downward, but inward, into a sleep-built knot of stillness, but of rhythm too subtle to disturb. When you wake, it's dusk again. That same warm, golden light filters through the olive branches, and Orpheus is sitting exactly where he was. Only now he's holding a different instrument altogether, an odd, round, pot-bellied harp strung with twine so thin it looks spun from cobwebs. You're not entirely sure how long you've slept. The air is cooler, more tender, as though the world itself is tiptoeing so as not to wake you. Orpheus doesn't greet you. He simply keeps playing, and you understand that the piece he's performing now wasn't meant to be interrupted by something so mundane as speech. It is delicate, but not fragile, like a breeze carrying old memories from across a bay. You sit up, wrap your arms around your knees, and listen. The notes tremble and shimmer, rising and fading like distant smoke signals. Eventually, he finishes with a flourish, but by allowing the final note to slip away, unattended. Then he says, "The strings are made from gut. Sheep gut, specifically. That's what gives it that honest kind of sadness." You blink slowly, absorbing that. He always starts with the weirdest details, as if the anatomy of an instrument is more important than its sound. But maybe for him it is. Sheep gut, you repeat. How ... poetic. Orpheus shrugs. They knew how to mourn. Have you ever listened to a sheep call after it's lost its lamb? You haven't. But now the shape of the sound seems to live in your chest anyway. He hands you a different lyre, simpler, plainer, with 5 sturdy strings stretched across a walnut frame. You run your fingers over them. It's rougher than you expected. Less of a song, more of a statement. He nods toward the horizon. We'll follow the herders tomorrow. Their bells always ring in different keys. Every goat, every sheep, its accidental harmony. No 2 herds sound the same. This, too, is something you never thought about. You remember hearing bells in the distance during long walks, always faint, always strangely calming, but you'd never once considered them a form of music. Orpheus had, of course. He likely catalogued whole herds by tone. That evening, you share figs and a wedge of salty cheese. Orpheus eats in silence, like he's listening to something you can't hear. Perhaps it's the chew of the cheese against his molars, or the friction of bread crust against tongue. Maybe even the tiny snaps of grasshoppers beginning their evening rituals. He finally speaks, low and slow. I once wrote a whole melody based on a kitchen fire. You turn toward him. A fire. It popped, he says, and cracked, in triplets. I kept feeding it dry twigs, just to keep the tempo. His face is unreadable again, as if he's unsure whether it was a song or a mistake. He fell in love with everything, wants to say something, even flames. That night, you camp near a shallow stream. The stones under the water are polished smooth, and the current flows with a sort of melodic insistence. You lie on your back and listen, not for fish or frogs or winds, but for the rhythm beneath the rhythm. What Orpheus calls the intent of the sound, the motive hiding inside the motion. He doesn't play tonight, not once. And the absence of his music makes everything else louder: the rustling reeds, the hum of gnats, the dripping of condensation from your cup. You realize that silence, in Orpheus's world, is a conductor. It brings the rest of the orchestra forward. Sleep takes longer to arrive this time, but it's a different kind of waiting. Not restlessness, but readiness. As if your mind has agreed to lower its defenses and let the noises of the world tuck it in, before you drift. Orpheus speaks almost in a whisper. Tomorrow we'll find the old windmill. If we sit quietly, it'll sing for us. But only if we don't ask it to. You smile with your eyes closed. That sounds exactly like something a windmill would demand. The crickets begin again, gently overlapping in calandrous ponson, endless, sleepless choir. and once again, the rhythm finds you. You wake with the first scent of dew. Orpheus is already up, crouched by the stream, washing his hands as though cleansing them of the night's stillness. He doesn't speak at first, just gestures with a tilt of his chin that today, the windmill awaits. You stretch slowly, your limbs humming with the memory of unfamiliar dreams, echoes of bells, soft footsteps in hay, the vague outline of something wooden spinning in the distance. You set off down a narrow path, lined with wild thyme and broom flowers. Orpheus walks ahead this time, humming a rhythm you don't recognize, low and under his breath, like something that wasn't meant to be shared but couldn't help escaping. His shadow flickers across the tall grasses, and you notice he steps around every beetle, every ant trail, as though he's learned not to disturb even the tiniest melodies of the earth. As the sun rises, you spot it, a crooked windmill perched on the crest of a low hill. It's older than you expected. Not broken, but not whole either. The slats of its sails are uneven, some twisted, others bowed. The whole thing leans slightly, like a man listening too hard. It doesn't turn, not yet. But you feel the air shifting. Orpheus stops halfway up the hill. He places his finger to his lips, then kneels and opens his satchel. From within, he takes a small, battered flute carved from bone. He sets it down beside him, but doesn't play. You do the same, kneeling beside him. In the tall grass, uncertain what you're waiting for. Then the breeze begins. Just a whisper at first. A tug at your sleeve, a rustle in the wheat. The sails creak, first one, then another, and the windmill lurches to life. Not with speed, but ceremony. Each rotation is a sentence in a language you're just beginning to understand. It's not smooth, it groans, it clicks. But it does sing. Orpheus doesn't speak. He closes his eyes and nods in time with the rotations. Then, gently, he lifts the bone flute to his lips and matches the rhythm, breath for breath, note for note. It's not a melody in the conventional sense. It's more like he's answering the windmill, conversing with it across the open field. You can't believe what you're hearing, because it isn't beautiful in the usual way. It's raw, it's splintered. It sounds like wood and bone arguing about who remembers the wind best. And then, you understand, the windmill is a musician. It's just old, and nobody has listened for a very long time. You close your eyes and let the clatter and whistle fill you. Somewhere behind you, a bird joins in, a red-throated thing with a cry like a cracked bell. The grass hisses, the breeze finds your ears and pulls gently at your hair. Orpheus plays softer now, as though coaxing the windmill into a story it's never had the courage to tell, and you do nothing but listen. It's enough. Later, after the wind has stilled and the sails hang motionless once more, you sit at the foot of the windmill with Orpheus. He traces a finger along a splintered gear, half buried in the dirt. It used to grind barley, he says absently, and sing lullabies for the village when the children wouldn't sleep. Did they hear it, you ask? Not really, he says. But it helped anyway. You take the flute in your hands and try a note. It squeaks, embarrassingly high. Orpheus doesn't laugh. He simply nods and says, "That's how you start." Even the windmill had to creak before it could speak. You camp there that night. Not in a tent or under trees, but inside the windmill itself, curled beside old sacks of forgotten grain and faded prayer cloths tied to the beams. It smells like earth and flower and sun-warmed wood. Orpheus lies on his back, arms folded beneath his head, watching the shadows crawl along the ceiling in the quiet. You begin to notice a new sound, a barely audible pulsing, like a breath drawn through cracked boards. It isn't the wind. It's the building itself, remembering its purpose. Perhaps it feels heard for the first time in years. You sleep deeply, dreamlessly, as if held in the palm of something larger than you, and when you wake, the windmill has stilled, but your breath carries its rhythm. The next morning arrives softly, the kind that doesn't so much begin as drift into awareness. You're slow to rise, your limbs reluctant to move, as though your body would rather stay part of the warm wood of the windmill forever. Orpheus is already sitting cross-legged in the corner, absently toying with a broken pulley wheel, turning it over and over in his hands like a question that never got answered. You stretch and sit up, blinking at the faded beams above. There, ancient nails jutting slightly where time has tugged the boards apart. In the stillness, the air is thick with the ghost of yesterday's music, like a scent you can't name, but recognize. And in that pause, you realize you're different now. Nothing outward has changed, but some small, quiet door inside you has opened, and it will never close again. You step outside with Orpheus, the morning sun casting long shadows behind you. The windmill looks even older in daylight, but also prouder somehow, like a dignified elder who finally got to tell their story. You thank it aloud, and though it doesn't respond, a breeze curls briefly around your legs, and you pretend it's a nod. The path today curves west, down toward the flatlands. It's a long, gentle descent through tall grasses and brushwood, where birds flit through the thickets like gossiping villagers. Orpheus doesn't speak much, he hums, mostly. And you start to hum back, not perfectly in tune, but close. Enough that something between you begins to braid into harmony. Hours pass this way. One step, one breath, one shared rhythm. By midday, you arrive at a stone marker, a single rectangular slab half buried in the dirt. There's no writing on it, just a carved spiral that loops inward without end. Orpheus taps it once with his flute and then kneels beside it. You do the same. This is the resting place of the archivist, he says softly. Not a person, a story. You look at him, puzzled. He smiles. Sometimes the story gets so big, it forgets the person who carried it. All that's left is the shape it left behind. And that's what the spiral is, a shape that doesn't end, that folds back on itself endlessly, like breath, like memory, like the way Orpheus tells time. He reaches into his satchel and pulls out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, a broken music box, its winding key long gone. He places it gently at the base of the marker. It belonged to the archivist's grandmother, he says. They say she could hum lullabies that made wheat grow straighter. You don't ask questions. You just sit, watch the wind stir the cloth, and try to remember your own grandmother's songs. You can almost hear one thin and fraying like a ribbon left in the sun. You stay like that until the sun begins to dip, and the sky turns the color of lavender and coal. Orpheus stands, brushing off his knees. Come on, he says. The amphora fields are just ahead. You've never heard of an amphora field before, but you don't ask. With Orpheus, every new word is a gift-trapped mystery. The path winds downward through a break in the trees, and opens onto a wide stretch of land speckled with tall clay vessels and free of every size and hue. Some are cracked and crumbling. Others shine as though freshly fired. They sprout from the ground like mushrooms after rain, each one slightly tilted, some with their mouths sealed with wax, others open to the sky. You approach one cautiously. Inside, nothing, just silence. Orpheus walks among them reverently, his fingers brushing their rims. "These are song jars," he says. "Each one holds a forgotten melody. You just have to listen long enough." He kneels by one and places his ear against it. You do the same with another. At first, it's just the echo of your own breath, but then something else. A hum, so low and distant it might not be real. A woman's voice, perhaps. Or a wind. Trapped long ago. You move from jar to jar, listening. One crackles with laughter. Another purrs like a distant sea. One holds a single note so sweet and lonely that it brings tears to your eyes before you know why. Orpheus stands at the center of the field and raises his flute again, not to play this time, but to listen. He doesn't move for a long time. Then finally, in the still air between evening and night, he begins to play not a melody of his own, but the ones pulled from the jars, pieced together like shards of an old vase made whole again, and the field responds. The jars tremble slightly. Some hum back. A few let loose short, breathy whistles, like sighs of relief. One emits a rusty clang that makes you laugh out loud, though you don't know why. You join him, not with an instrument, but with your voice. Tentative at first, then steady, then full. You match his tone, find a harmony, add a descant. You don't know where the song is going, but you know it's the right direction. Together, you and Orpheus fill the amphora field with music. It isn't perfect, it isn't planned, but it is true. And when the last note fades into the night, the field is silent again but charged, as though something lost has been found, or remembered. You don't speak as you leave. The moon is rising, and your footsteps feel sacred. Tomorrow, Orpheus says, you'll visit the orchard where dreams ripen like peaches. But tonight, you rest in the hush left behind after the jars have sung. And somewhere in the distance, the windmill turns once, just once, creaking out its approval.
sleep.